Okay, good evening. Welcome. My name is Pat Kowitzel, and I'm the buyer and author program coordinator at Magic City Books. I want to thank you for taking a little bit of time on your Wednesday evening to join us tonight for another in our virtual author program series. We've been doing these exclusively at the store, really for a little over a year now, where we've been doing just virtual programs. And many of them have been recorded, including a number of other programs that are related to the Tulsa Race Massacre. And so I encourage you to take a moment and check out our channel on YouTube. You can just search Magic City Books on YouTube and be able to find us. There's a whole playlist of author conversations related to the Tulsa Race Massacre. Tonight's conversation with Tim will be included in that tomorrow when we get it posted up there. And so you can check out all of those programs and everything else that we've done basically since last June, all on our YouTube channel. We have a number of other upcoming programs that are coming in the next days and weeks ahead. And we are going to be remaining virtual through June and July for the most part until at least until the end of July. And so we've got some stuff in the works to be doing an in-person event near the end of July. But right now we're sticking to the online events. And so if you're joining us from Tulsa, thank you for being here yet again. If you're joining us from somewhere outside of the Tulsa area, welcome. If this is your very first time with Magic City Books, we're very glad that you're here. We're going to be posting links for books in the chat tonight, and so you can check that out. But also, we really want to hear from you. We want your questions, and so please post those in the Q&A. There will be time before we're done tonight where we will have a chance to hear from audience members and get questions asked. And so please do share those in the Q&A, and we will get to as many as time allows tonight. Tonight we are joined by the author Tim Madigan, and Tim wrote a book about the Tulsa Race Massacre about 20 years ago, at a time when knowledge of the Tulsa Race Massacre was pretty limited, not just nationally, but even locally. Somebody that did not grow up in Tulsa, I don't have that same story of not hearing about the race massacre in school. I didn't. We didn't hear about it in Iowa in school, but we certainly, people of my age weren't hearing about it in school if they lived in Tulsa either. And a lot of work went into making that not be true. And Tim's book has been an important piece of that puzzle, an important part of getting this story more widely known. And so we're really fortunate to be able to welcome Tim Madigan tonight to talk a little bit about his book, The Burning, and the new young readers adaptation of the book that also just was released. The book does have a new afterword, and so whether you had an old copy on your shelf or not, you want to pick up a new one, or certainly be able to pick up a book for a friend or a family member or a neighbor that you think needs to know more about this events and this history. So I want to thank you all again for joining us tonight. And without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Tim Madigan. Tim?
Thanks, Pat. It's really, it's good to see you again. I saw you 5 hours ago or 6 hours ago. I guess it was at the store, and I live in Fort Worth, and so I just rolled back into my home in Fort Worth, and glad to be doing this after really 3 of the most remarkable days of my life. I don't think it's any exaggeration to say that. The events of 1921 have been such a big part of my life since going back to the year 2000. I'll talk about that in a minute. But it wasn't, as Pat was saying, it wasn't, very few people knew about it. And that has changed over the years. And I think it's with the attention that was paid to the anniversary with President Biden's visit and other things, the events of the last year and the surrounding race. I think that as difficult as it is, I mean, the subject matter is difficult and it's painful, but I think that we're all better off as people, as a nation, to know our true history. And unfortunately, this is part of it. And so we are, I think we are much further along today than we were even a few days ago after the events of a few days. And having been in Tulsa the last few days, I know that for the descendants of survivors, it has been really an extraordinary and healing time. Just kind of organically, they were finding each other and having these experiences. In fact, I had one myself when we were in signing books earlier today, where the descendants of a very prominent member of Greenwood 1921, Dr. A.C. Jackson, known across the country as a really fine physician. But unfortunately, he was murdered during the massacre. But while we were there signing, some of his descendants came in, and we got to visit with them. And so, it was just all very meaningful and sacred for me anyway. And so I was really glad to have the opportunity to do that, and really glad that we've gotten to this place. In 21 years ago now, I guess, for 50 years, the massacre was just not known by anyone. From 1921 until 1971, when the first magazine article was written locally in Tulsa about it, it just wasn't spoken of. But even then, going up through the 1990s, when the Tulsa Race Riot Commission was formed, and did the first deep investigation of what had happened and published a report. There was a lot of press, both nationally and internationally, about that at the time. But still, and then I published my book in 2001, and still people weren't talking about Tulsa, and they weren't talking about race in the country generally. My exposure to the story, I was born and raised in a small town. Pat and I share a northern upbringing. He's from Iowa, I'm from Minnesota. Northern Minnesota, small farming community, about 100 miles south of the Canadian border, and there are no Black people where I grew up. And finally, after, in my early 20s, after getting tired of Minnesota winters, I moved to Texas and worked in newspapers in Texas. But I had no knowledge of race history in this nation, and no real interest in it, frankly. So anyway, I knew about the basics. I knew about Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and some of those things, but my knowledge of race history was thin at best. So one day at my newspaper, I was working at the Fort Worth Star-Telegram at the time. My editor, Julie Heberlin, came up to me and handed me a printout of a story from Oklahoma about something called the Tulsa Race Riot Commission, and what the commission had done. And reading that story, it said that in May 31st, June 1st, 1921, this affluent, very prosperous African-American community called Greenwood was destroyed by a mob of thousands of white people. Hundreds are killed, thousands left homeless, thousands of homes and businesses destroyed. And when I read this, I just looked at her and I said, this can't be true. Anything this horrible, we would have known about. And she said, well, that was exactly my reaction. So she sent me to Tulsa and to do a long newspaper story for the Star-Telegram. And back then it was, again, 21 years ago, and many of the survivors were still alive. And I had the great good fortune to visit with many of them, hear their stories, and listen. And one of a very memorable or a very vivid memory for me of my first reporting trip to Tulsa was I interviewed the state representative, Don Ross, who represented Greenwood, and was very instrumental in getting the Race Riot Commission formed. And anyway, I interviewed him, and then we went out to dinner, just a friendly dinner. I thought my work for the day was over. And so we're in this Chinese restaurant in Tulsa and looking at our menus, and I'm just trying to make conversation. So I said to him, Don, so tell me, what was it like for African Americans in the United States after the Civil War? And he raised up, he's kind of a bombastic guy, and he raised up and he smashed his fist down on the table, and loud enough to make the silverware jump, and people in this restaurant turned and looked. And he said, you're one of the educated whites. He said, if we can't count on you to know our history, who can we count on? And so, I was appropriately ashamed. And, I didn't know the history. And then the newspaper piece led to an opportunity to write the book, The Burning. But it was in the process of writing the book that one of the things I tried to do was to place Tulsa in its proper historical context. And one of the things that, one of the most horrifying things to me was that what happened in Tulsa was not just some horrible, historic fluke or one-off. It was perfectly consistent with that time in the United States, unique perhaps only in its magnitude. I learned really for the first time about the realities of Jim Crow and the prevalence of racial violence, the lynching. Back then, the term was race riots, when there were really race massacres that happened in cities and towns across the United States. Lynching had become kind of a spectator sport in places. And the fact how prevalent this notion was in our nation of white superiority, going up to the highest levels of our government, to the White House and beyond. The first real movie blockbuster in the nation, or in the country, was called Birth of a Nation in 1915 by a celebrated filmmaker named D.W. Griffith, which was nothing more really than a celebration of the reincarnation of the Ku Klux Klan, which invoked these most odious racial stereotypes. And it was played to sold out theaters in North and South alike. I mean, that was just the nature of the time. And in 1921, a few years before, tens of thousands of Black soldiers had fought for the nation in World War I, expecting, I think, that by virtue of their service, they and their people would be treated better at home, when in fact what had happened when they got home was the conditions had deteriorated even more. And so that was really an eye-opening for me. And a big part of this story, and kind of my sermon that I've been talking about quite a bit, and I just wrote an essay about this in Salon magazine that was published a few days ago, that when I learned the history, I was horrified and saddened and all those things, but something within me changed. That somehow in learning the history, the humanity of people different than me had been revealed in ways that it hadn't been before. I became, I think, capable of much more compassion. I was more curious. I wanted to continue to educate myself about the history, but I just made a connection really in the last 6 weeks or so to another experience I had as a writer. And that was back in 1995, I met, I had the great good fortune to meet Fred Rogers in Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. I was doing a profile on him again for the Fort Worth paper. And I went and I spent 4 days with him in the fall of 1995. And from that point on until he died in 2003, he, as strange as it seems, he had become one of my closest friends. Well, it was also a very, very difficult time in my life. I suffered from depression, and it was, it was really a painful time in my life. And Fred kind of mentored me through a lot of that. But one thing in particular was in the early summer of 1996, after I'd known him for several months, I wrote him a letter that said, "Dear Fred, you know, here's what's really going on with me." And Fred was the kind of person who wanted to know the truth of your life, no matter what it was. So I shared with him in this letter about this years of deep depression and suffering and low self-esteem, and just went on and on. And I said, at the heart of everything, Fred, is this haunting notion that all of my life I've been trying to get my father to be proud of me. And for whatever reason, it's never really felt like I've succeeded. So in this letter, I said to him, Fred, I have a question to ask you. Would you be proud of me? You know, that is strange, no? But for whatever reason, I folded it up, put an envelope like the stamp, and mailed it away. And his reply came on July 1st, 1996. And the answer to your question, Tim, is yes, in capital letters and exclamation points. A resounding yes, I am proud of you. I will be proud of you. I have been proud of you since first we met. And then he went on to say some really other remarkable things. And, you know, so he was very much there for me at this time in my life. However, probably a month or two later, he wrote me a letter in which he asked the question, tell me about your dad. What was his childhood like? And I wrote back to Fred and I said, well, Fred, I don't know. I've never asked. But I started to ask my dad about his childhood, and what I learned broke my heart. His childhood in this small town in Western North Dakota was one of deprivation and neglect. I realized that he had given me 10 times more as a father than his father had given him. I started to see not just his imperfections, but his positive qualities. And it really transformed the way I looked at my father. And, you know, so that when he died a decade ago, and what I felt then was not any of this angst, this old angst, but just the most pure form of sorrow. And a few weeks ago, I realized that the same thing had happened for me when I learned the story about race in this country. My heart was changed. And one of my favorite sayings of Fred Rogers is, it's much easier to love someone when you know their story. And when I learned the story of race in this country, it really changed. It allowed the humanity of another person or another people to be revealed in ways that had not been the case before. You know, that is, and I think that, excuse me, I think that there's a larger thing here. Excuse me, is that I just feel like there are millions of other white people in the nation, people of goodwill, like, you know, such as myself, whose lives would be transformed or changed as mine was when they learned the history. And since the killing of George Floyd a year ago and the reckoning that's happened since, there have been a lot of white people who have taken it upon themselves to try to educate themselves more deeply about the history of race in this country. And one of the places they've turned is to my book. And so I'm hearing from reader after reader after reader who have said, again, I had no idea this had happened, but reading this has really caused me to look at things in a new way. And so I just, one of the things that, you know, there's been a lot of talk about what the remedies are to what's going on with race in this country, systemic racism, question of reparations. But I think that, you know, I've come to believe very strongly that I think the first step in all this is a broad awareness of our history. And I think because of it started, I think, really with HBO's Watchmen in the fall of 2019, and the first 10 minutes of that very popular series where it was a very unstinting depiction of what happened in Tulsa. And they used my book as source material. And the night that it happened, and I actually, when I was in Tulsa, the last 3 days, through the bookstore, actually, was kind enough to invite me to a small dinner with Damon Lindelof and Cord Jefferson. Damon was the creator of Watchmen. Cord was a writer who won an Emmy for one of the episodes. And Damon said that the first night, it was a very popular miniseries, but the first night after the first night, what was trending on Twitter was not Watchmen, but it was Tulsa. And the director of Watchmen told me that she had learned that the night that the first episode aired, 500,000 people did internet searches on Tulsa to ask the question whether or not what had been depicted was actually true. And then of course the answer was yes. And so that kind of helped break through. And then gradually over the last year, and then finally with this weekend, with President Biden's visit, with all the attention both here nationally and internationally to the anniversary, I just think that we're much further along on the awareness piece. And so, I just think I'm hopeful. I mean, there's difficult questions to be discussed, but I think once the awareness has grown, I think that people are much more capable of engaging in healthy discussion. By now, I'm thinking that most of you know the basic story of what happened that night. That a young Black Dick Rowland was accused of assaulting a young white woman named Sarah Page on an elevator in downtown Tulsa. The charges, the accusation was probably had no merit. I think the authorities even conceded that, but Rowland was arrested. I think the thing would have probably fizzled out were it not for some of the coverage in one of the white Tulsa newspapers, including a front page headline that people remember to read, "To Lynch Negro Tonight." And within a couple of hours of that hitting the street, hundreds of people had gathered around the courthouse, either to participate in the lynching of Dick Rowland or to observe it. Because I said these things didn't happen in secret at that time. Back in Greenwood, again, these African-American men or citizens of Greenwood, again, many of them veterans, had a resolve that they weren't going to let this happen. They weren't going to let this happen in Tulsa. They weren't going to stand idly by and watch one of their own be treated this way. And so they went to the courthouse armed to offer their services to the sheriff. The sheriff said, "I've got this, boys, go back home." The African Americans actually made 2 trips to the courthouse. The second one was at about 10:30, and then a shot was fired, probably accidentally. But both sides were heavily armed, and so that precipitated a deadly exchange. Up to a dozen people fell dead at the courthouse. The blacks fell back across the tracks to Greenwood to prepare for what they knew was to come. And sure enough, at 5:08 a.m. over the night, thousands of people, thousands of white people had been armed and had been marshaled at strategic points along Greenwood. And at 5:08 a.m., there was a whistle that clearly was a signal for the attack to begin. And while the Greenwood residents tried to defend their property as best they could, they were greatly outnumbered and greatly outgunned. And within a few hours, they were overrun. And by the noon of the next day of June 1st, and you've seen the pictures, many of you have seen the pictures. And I think that, and the story of atrocity after atrocity, like the killing of Dr. Jackson that I mentioned earlier, and like those mentioned by President Biden in his speech, and I think that a big part of the awareness of what is necessary is for someone like the president to come to Tulsa and name it for what it was. It wasn't a riot. It was a massacre, the likes of which I don't think this country's ever seen. And then it was covered up. So we're in a different place. And with that, and I'm just been so grateful, a very unlikely person to be engaged in this work as someone who was born and raised where I was and with my background. But I've been so grateful that I've had an opportunity to be a part of this discussion, be a part of this story over these years, and then finally to experience the last 3 days, which I think were just very healing for so many people, and I think unpleasant, yes, for the country, but I think healing even for the country. So anyway, I'm hopeful, and if you guys have any questions or comments, I'd love to engage you in discussion for any of you out any of you out there.
All right, thank you, Tim. I'm going to kick off. We do have one question from Facebook, but first I just wanted, after spending a couple days in Tulsa, I just want to know kind of what impressions you have of Tulsa now versus 21 years ago when you first came on this assignment. Maybe you'd been to Tulsa before, but kind of what were your impressions now versus that time when you first came up to learn about the Riot Commission and learn what they were doing and get some reporting done?
Yeah, it's changed so much. And what I think of first is that when my book was first published, it was pretty much ignored by everyone. And I think part of that was that I just didn't, maybe people weren't ready to read that story. But one of the first things I went to, one of the first events I went to on kind of lose track of time, my first day in Tulsa, I guess it was around noon of the 31st, whatever day that was. I was at one of the churches in town, and there was a bunch of people gathered, and Jesse Jackson was speaking, and but standing in the crowd, I noticed was the mayor, G.T. Bynum. And he's someone I've come to have a great deal of admiration for, because of the courage, political and otherwise, that he's exhibited over the last few years in terms of being the driving force behind the search for mass graves, and basically talking about his own story of not knowing about this for years and years, even though his forebears go back to the founding, were some of the founding fathers of Tulsa. And basically said, I don't think anyone wants to live in a community that hasn't really come to terms with this. And one of the ways we can come to terms with this is to try to find the graves of people who are buried and to try to do the right thing by them and answer these big questions of history. He is, and I said to him, I went up to him and I introduced myself, and he and I had visited on the telephone before. But we had never met in person. I introduced myself, and he knew who I was, and he knew about the book. But I said, "You're carrying a heavy burden, aren't you?" And he said, "Yes, I am." And I said, "Well," I said, I think all of this, what you've done, and all of this is really is so important in terms of the step in the right direction. I'm thinking as part of this, as part of what's happening here, we'll all be in a much better place to have a real discussion about whatever we do moving forward. And he said, yes. He said, that is my hope. Now, 20 years ago, I would not have had that conversation with the mayor of Tulsa. And so you asked what's changed. And I think that's a big part of it. And he hasn't, you know, and I'm sure he's taken some political heat for some of the things he's done, but he wants to do the right thing. And then later that day, he put out a very strong statement in which he apologized for the fact that the city leaders in Tulsa, the city officials and the police and law enforcement did not do what they needed to do to protect their citizenry. And he said, obviously I wasn't alive then, and I wasn't directly involved with that, but I am part of this community now, and I know I would encourage people to read it for themselves, because it's very strongly worded and clearly authentic statement on behalf of the mayor. Now he's come out against reparations, but I've developed a theory over time of the three A's. One is awareness. The first is awareness. The second one is what was the second one? Apology. Second one's apology. Someone has to say, we're sorry. I mean, as part of the spiritual paradigm that's been taught, I think, forever and ever. First, you need to be aware of what the wrong was. Then someone needs to say they're sorry. And then you can start to talk about the third A, which is amends, whatever they might turn out to be. You know, that's going to be a very complicated discussion, obviously. But we've done so much with the first A over the last couple of years. And in Tulsa, the mayor's apologized. And I just think that is so important. That is so important. But again, that wouldn't have happened 20 years ago. People were much more kind of committed to trying to ignore the history, not only here in Tulsa, but around the country. And I think that the community, from stem to stern, the community is bought in to try to participate in this, in the commemoration of the centennial. It has genuinely been a community undertaking. So I just think that there's Tulsa was a metaphor for the most horrible parts of our race history, and I also think that it can be a metaphor or a leader in how we come to terms with a lot of our history.
Yeah. Yes. We have a question from Lean, I think, from Facebook, and so her question is: when you wrote the book, were you able to speak with any of Tulsa officials from 1921? You'd mentioned that you were able to talk to a few survivors. Were you able to talk to anyone that was, you know, the timing of that, it was hard, but were you able to talk to anyone that was around kind of from the official side of Tulsa in 1921? Did you run into any roadblocks regarding the events of the race massacre, such as the cover up of those events, even decades later?
Well, you know, the short answer to that question is no, which speaks to how effective the conspiracy of silence was on the white side of things. I mean, people just did not talk about it, and over the years, over the decades, certain people took it upon themselves to try to interview whites who participated in this. And some of them told their stories, and, you know, but not many, and never by name. And I think that, and this question has come up a lot in the last few weeks as I've been talking about it. Clearly, this was orchestrated somehow. Clearly, people were being recruited, marshaled, and assigned to various places in Greenwood, or on the border of Greenwood. But I think it's lost to history as to who exactly that was, because it's just people weren't talking about it, and so, you know, I did talk to several white people who were clearly not part of the mob and were horrified by what happened, and did what they could to try to give shelter and comfort to the people who were victimized by this, but never the ones who actually participated. And I think that in the immediate aftermath of this, there was even some celebratory moods. You know, the mobsters were putting notches in their guns to signify how many blacks they killed. But quickly, it became apparent that many people were liable to face murder charges, and official Tulsa realized very early on that what had happened was going to be a terrible stain on the image of the city, and so they felt like it was in their best interest to try to do what they could to cover it up. So anyway, that again, the short answer is no. I think everybody hopes for some documents or something to be unearthed to give more clarity into how all those things unfolded, but that just doesn't exist right now.
Yeah, you mentioned that, you know, when the book was first released, it kind of didn't get much attention. Nobody, you know, at that time, there wasn't a lot kind of happening with it. And we've had similar conversations with other authors that had books coming out around that time. Two novelists, Jewel Parker Rhodes, her book Magic City, predated yours by just a couple of years, and was a novel set in Greenwood. Rilla Askew wrote a novel called Fire and Beulah that some critical attention, but not any real sales numbers. And here in Oklahoma, I mean, you know, not just, you know, beyond Oklahoma, but here in Oklahoma, it continued to not be something that was talked about. Many of the folks that are watching tonight may have read, I think have read a lot of the books about the race massacre. We've heard a lot of different things over these last couple of weeks, but, you know, talking about those 3 A's, awareness was hardly even there at the time of that first race riot commission 20 years ago. There was still a lot of work that was being done, and really, you know, 4 years ago, I would say there was still work being done to say this really happened, these things were real, and we were, you know, whether it was, how much of that was the Watchmen, how much of that was just, you know, all of the other work that's been going into it, and the researchers and stuff. But, you know, I think that now we are fully able, you know, we're not having any conversations about, did this really happen? Was this, how bad was it really? It can't have been that bad. That initial reaction that many had, just as you said when you first started, you know, that can't have been the case because we know about it.
Right.
You know, it happened not that long ago. It happened when there was daily newspaper coverage. We're not talking about something from the Revolutionary War where, yes, there could be a battle that we had missed. I get somehow, you know, because of something awful that had happened. But, you know, this was post World War I. This is, you know, there are cars, there are planes, there's communication, and then within 5 years, it never gets talked about locally or certainly anywhere else.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it really is one of the most interesting stories in American history, I think, is how something of this magnitude could have been lost to history for this long. I think one of the things that I'm going to have to reread Biden's speech because I thought it was really terrific. That he said, you know, something like, you might try to hide history, but you can never kill it, or something like that, you know, it's always going to be there. And one of the things that I did a piece, a long piece for Smithsonian Magazine on this that was came out in April, which gave me the opportunity to go back and talk to a lot of the descendants of survivors, many of whom I talked to their grandparents or whatever years ago. And, you know, it will live, even if it's not talked about. The manifestations, the consequences, the feelings of something like that will live in a community. And several of the descendants of survivors talked about having the sense of felt like they were growing up in households of Holocaust victims, because they knew that something terrible had happened to their parents or grandparents, but they didn't know what it was because nobody was talking about it. And, but, that those kind of things are passed down from generation to generation. And one of the really important thing is late in their lives when these people, and from especially in the 1990s on, when these people finally felt comfortable in telling their stories. And I feel so fortunate that I had come on the scene at the time when that was just beginning, and so many of those people were still alive. Their stories were so vivid, and it really allowed me to write about this in a much different way than I would have been had I come across this story even 10 years later.
Right. We have a question here from Marcia. Marcia says, thank you for your strength and stamina, and thank you even more for your talent and perseverance in writing this book. The nation needs you to continue your quest. What is your next step?
Well, I don't know specifically other than to say that there is one. One of the questions that people in my line of work and filmmakers and whatever have to come to terms with or have to wrestle with is, okay, I've written this story the best I know how about what actually happened, but there's so many other stories to be told out of this. And one of them is I've become good friends with a guy named Nate Calloway, who's a filmmaker in LA, and he's a great grandson of J.B. Stratford, one of the most prominent entrepreneurs in Greenwood at the time. And J.B. Stratford had this remarkable story going back to slavery, where his father, the mistress of his father, taught him to read and write, and then the father taught JB, and it really changed the whole trajectory of their family. He ended up graduating from Overland College and got a law degree from Indiana University, and again came to Greenwood, came to Tulsa in 1905 at the break before the oil strike, and it became this, and then he lost everything in the massacre, fled under the cover of darkness, ended up in Chicago, but ended up founding this American dynasty that of remarkable people. But there is stories like that, and any time you tell the story of people like J.B. Stratford, you cannot ignore what happened during the massacre. But I think that there's a lot, especially in the African American community, there's a big desire to tell the story. This term "in spite of" has become important to a lot of people. What these people achieved in spite of the headwinds and things that they faced growing up in the and living in the United States. So one of the things I've did over the last 3 days is talk to people like Nate and other people, and talk to David Lindelof and Cord Berry, and about, okay, how do we build on what we've already done? And how best can we tell this story that can contribute to the next phase and whatever it is we're going to go through as a nation with regards to this? I don't think anybody's really come up with, there are many answers, but I just know that the people who do what I do and filmmakers are really wrestling with that, knowing that the work has just begun. We just don't, something will happen. We just don't know exactly what it's going to be.
Yeah. We have another question from Facebook. This one's from Marlon, and Marlon says, there's a scene in your book that describes William Holloway downtown as the massacre began. He hides behind a pillar as he witnesses a mob beating and presumably murdering a black man. He didn't think he could do anything to help. He probably couldn't in that situation. I wonder if you recall anything from such interviews about the impact on those white folks who stood by as it happened. They didn't participate in violence, but also didn't do anything to stop or resist it. Anything you can say about this or these kinds of situations?
Well, again, that has come up quite a bit, in my discussions with people the last few weeks. I wish I could say I had some insight into that. I wish I could say I came across material that would shed some light on that. But all I can do is surmise and kind of wonder that what was it like for people who stood by and did nothing, or were just kind of passive witnesses to this. How did they sleep the next several nights? What was going on in their dreams? What were the wives of some of these people who participated in this? What was their reaction to what their husbands or whatever had done? I can only guess at this. But if you really kind of dig into this from a human level, you know that even one of the important things I tried to do in the book was to portray white characters who clearly had a moral compass and clearly were completely horrified and totally, condemned what had happened in the strongest terms. And I do have several of those in the book. One of them being Sheriff Willard McCullough, who told the mob that you're going to have to kill me to get to this prisoner. And I think he was being very genuine about that. And the reason that I think that's important is it shows that people knew right from wrong even then. It wasn't as if the rules of right and wrong had been suspended because 10,000 people were involved. People knew what was right and wrong. And when you transgress so far, as so many in that mob did, even though you might not be prosecuted, that is going to leave a stain on your soul. And I think it is going to leave a stain on the community. And there's one story that one of the researchers came up with in the 50s, that whenever, in the very rare occasion when Tulsa came up, or the massacre came up in any kind of a public way, which is a very rare thing, the wife of this guy would say her husband would just all of a sudden get very quiet, and in one case disappeared for days on end and no one knew where he went. So this what happened lived in the bones and the DNA of white Tulsa for generation upon generation. And Hillary Beard, who adapted the Burning for Young Readers, and she was with me today at your store, she was kind of trying to do the math. So Tulsa at that time was maybe 80,000 people. 10,000 were African American, so that takes it down to 70,000 people. And of the 70,000 white people, you figure half of them were probably children. So then now you're left with 35,000 people. And again, this is just kind of a grim parlor game, I realize. Now you're left with 35,000 people. The mob was estimated to be up to 10,000 people strong. So that means that if our math is anywhere close to being true, 1 in 3 people participated. And so it doesn't take a great deal of imagination to imagine the psychic stain that had existed in those people over time. But again, because of the nature of this, we just don't have concrete portrayals, concrete testimonies to the kinds of things that these people are asking, and I wish we did.
Right. Well, and one of the things that you have touched on, and other conversations that we've had about 1921 in these last few weeks and months, is just how segregated Tulsa was in 1921. Right there, we were. I mean, just in factoring those numbers, 80,000 people, 10,000 of whom were Black, and virtually, 100% of that group were living in Greenwood and
right.
the railroad tracks. So, I mean, outside of maybe people who didn't have a home there that lived at if they were a servant or something like that. I mean, there was not a, there was a mixed community in Tulsa. And here we are 100 years later, and in a lot of ways, in a lot of parts of this community and in a lot of parts of American communities all over the country, that is still the truth. That you don't see people that don't look just like you at work, at school, at church, at the grocery store, at the restaurant. It goes on and on and on. And having, just knowing that these other people are fully realized, full people with the same kinds of concerns and worries and hopes and dreams that you have in your community, kind of bringing those people together. There are, these last few days have been a small step, and hopefully we can continue to build on that here in Tulsa, but also as a country.
Well, I totally agree. And, one of the things that, that I think the mayor and city leaders are trying to do something about is the degree to which there are still two Tulsas. The Tulsa remains segregated, and the quality of life in white Tulsa it's much better than it is for black Tulsa. And these things are, again, they're complicated and won't be resolved overnight, but there is awareness, I think, that something needs to be done to try to remedy this. But, I had I don't know how I think a lot of this has changed with the younger people who tend to be much more colorblind, and race is much less of an issue. And they tend, to socialize with people and kind of across ethnic and those sorts of things. So I don't think it's as much of an issue for young people, but for people my age, and I said this facetiously, that from the time I got to Tulsa, I think it was on Sunday night, until the time I left a few hours ago, I spent all of my time with African-American friends that I've just known, Hillary and her friend Sue being two of them, Nate Calloway and his cousin Aaron, being two more. And I swear to God, it was the first time in my life that I've spent that amount of time with people who are different than me. And I said to them, in jest, but there's some thing, if I'd had known I was going to have this much fun hanging out with black people, I'd have started doing it a long time ago. Again, I said it in jest, but there's a, it's like there's something important in that statement. Is that, and Hillary has made the comment that when you don't really know black people, and then when black people don't really know white people, both sides lose. Learning about people, interacting with people different than yourself improves your life. It doesn't detract from it. And it's harder, I suppose, for someone my age to cross that threshold, because we've done things the same way for so long. But I just hope that I just feel very grateful and fortunate to, again, this weekend was the first time I had that experience, and it occurred to me that that it was lovely, and I just if we could just kind of step out of our comfort zones a bit, I just think that there's a whole nother world world waiting for us out there, when we can become more broaden our horizons this way.
You mentioned Hillary a couple of times, and we just have a couple minutes before we're gonna have to go. But the Burning recently received a young readers adaptation, and Hillary Beard adapted your work for a younger audience. And so I just want to talk a little bit about how that came together and make another recommendation to get this book for the young people in your life. There is not a better nonfiction book. I mean, there's some novels that are set in Greenwood that are for a little bit younger audience. There's some really excellent ones. Randy Pink wrote a book called Angel of Greenwood that came out earlier this year. Jennifer Latham wrote Dreamland Burning a few years ago, and that one's been very, very popular. But those are fictionalized stories. There is not a nonfiction account that really is intended for those younger readers to be able to deal with some of these more mature themes and harsh realities of those events. And Hillary did just such a wonderful job. You were both in the store today, graciously signing copies. Tell us just a little bit before we go about kind of that adaptation, how that came to be, and working with Hillary.
Well, we have Kate Farrell, an editor with Henry Holt in New York, to thank. She and Henry Holt for young readers was a senior editor there. And it started with her watching Watchmen and her teenage son saying, "Did this really happen?" And she didn't know. She found out that it did, and she said, and he had the idea, we need to do a book about this for people my son's age, because anyway, and she and I both felt like it was imperative that we have an African-American writer do it. And just because I'm really kind of cluing into the fact that as hard as I try, I can never really totally understand what it's like to be an African-American in this country, having not lived it. And we needed a really talented, sensitive writer who could bring that perspective to this book. And Hillary was perfect. She's just a terrific person, a great writer. And one of the things she did, in addition to, frankly, it's still very strong in terms of its portrayal of some of the violence. There's no soft pedaling it. But as an African-American person, it's very important to her to not just talk about the terrible nature of it, but the miracle of Greenwood itself and what these people had achieved. And so anyway, I was a little nervous when she started working on it. What's this Black writer going to think about what I've done? And she's always been very kind and very gracious and very complimentary. But she definitely did put her own take on it. She definitely is not an adapter, but she's a co-author of this book. And so, and we're just delighted that it's there. I think one of the great challenges and one of the great failings of our nation has been how this has not been taught. And we're hoping that this book is a resource for teachers and for parents to introduce their children and young students to this topic. And I think that when you introduce them to this topic, you introduce them or make them more aware of the much broader issue, because in both the original version and in this new one, we go to great pains to put Tulsa in context and share a lot of the race history that led up to what happened in 1921.
Well, they're both excellent. They're both in our 1921 collection. There's a link there in the chat. And we just want to, again, Tim, thank you very much for making some time tonight and talking with us and being a part of our event series for the Tulsa 1921 Centennial. And so thank you very much. Thank you for coming and sharing these stories with us as readers. We really look forward to what comes next.
Yeah, me too. And thank you for thinking for all you're doing. It's a beautiful store. Bookstores are so important. The experience of being in a bookstore, you can't beat it. And so Kilder and I really both enjoyed our time with you today. And so we wish you Godspeed and hope to see you again sometime.
Sounds good. Thank you very much. And thank you all. We'll be back again Sunday afternoon. Carol Anderson's new book, The Second, will be our topic on Sunday afternoon at 2 o'clock. Hope you'll join us then. Thank you all very much. Have a good night.